I think we'll go ahead and get started rolling tonight on this program. I'm happy to introduce our speaker tonight, Mary Burnette. I'll tell you a little bit more about her in just a second. For those of you that haven't met me before, I'm the Public Programs Director here at the Western North Carolina Historical Association. And we're joined tonight by our very special guest, Mary Burnette. And we're also joined by Catherine Cutshall, who's the collection manager at the Buncombe County Special Collections. And I'll let her tell you a little bit more about that in just a second. I want to say briefly, tonight's program is the fifth in a series that we've been running called the LitCafe series, where we have local authors or authors who've written about Western North Carolina history or their own personal experiences. In Mary's case, we do these programs live, but we always record them and they'll be available on our website in just a few days. So if you registered for it, if you want to watch again, or if you have any questions, you'll get an email with a link to that, and you can always check them out on our website. I also asked that tonight during the event, if you have any questions, you can see the question and answer button, the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. If you'll please use that for questions. But I'll also ask, if what we were talking about at the beginning, if you've read Mary's book, let us know about it. Put it in the chat, let us know if you've read Mary's book. I'll go ahead and say that Mary, she was born in Black Mountain, and she lived there for her young life. She grew up in the 1930s and attended Clearview Elementary School before she later went to Allen High School here in Asheville. She went on to earn a master's degree in English and taught in Washington, D.C., and then at Cal State University at Los Angeles. Last year in 2020, Mary published her memoir, Lige of the Black Walnut Tree, Growing Up Black in Southern Appalachia, which depicts life in a close-knit community settled by former enslaved people. Her vibrant stories bring to life this world of her youth and open up a new window into an area of history little known to the outside world and described rarely by a native Black mountaineer. Mary grew up among the very real people she describes, the very real characters in her book. And she's determined to preserve the history of her cousin, one of her favorite cousins who passed away long before she was born, and she dedicated this book to his memory. So I'll let Mary tell you a little bit more about that, but first let's let Catherine tell you a little bit about what she's doing at Special Collections.
Hi all, and thanks Trevor and Ann and Wincha for having us, for letting Buncombe County Special Collections join on to this program. I was about to actually reach out to Mary when I saw that y'all had scheduled this, so I thought, oh, let's just band together and join forces. So thanks for letting us do that. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Catherine Calhoun Cutshall. I'm the collections manager at what is formerly the North Carolina Room at Pack Memorial Library, but at the beginning of this year, we changed our name to Buncombe County Special Collections, in keeping with a lot of big changes that we've made to our space in our library. So for those of you who have used the collection before, everything's still here. It's still the same. We haven't really gotten rid of much. We've just moved a bunch of things around, painted our walls. And so if you haven't been in since we've been open, we are now open all the same hours as Pack Memorial Library, and we're in the lower level where we were before. So please come on by and see us, see some of the changes, and we'll look forward to seeing you. The other thing I'm going to say is that all of our programming is made possible through the Friends of the Special Collections. So if you are interested in archives, libraries, and special collections, we would certainly love to hear from you. And if you have any questions about who we are or what we do, you can send us an email at packnc@buncombecounty.org, and I'll go ahead and put that in the chat. So that's all for me for now, and I'll turn it back over to Trevor and Mary.
All right, well, Mary, we are very excited to hear your presentation tonight. I'll be sharing your PowerPoint, so I'll be invisible here, hidden, but just know that throughout the program, if anybody has questions, like I said, put them in that Q&A and we'll get to them at the end. So Mary, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, and hello, everybody. My name is Mary Burnette, and yes, I was born and reared in Black Mountain, a wonderful little town. Just wanted to say a little about the title of my book, because I've had a lot of questions about it. Even one of my own children wanted to know, who is Lige? Well, Lige is Lige. It is a nickname for Elijah, and it was kind of consistently a nickname in Black Mountain for anyone named Elijah. Of course, I wanted his name to be remembered, but I wanted to tell you that there was a tradition about nicknames in my community. Usually we were kind of secretive about them. Yeah, sometimes they didn't go outside the household, and they certainly didn't go outside the village. We didn't take them outside the village. So if you should be visiting in my old community and you find people looking at you strangely when you talked about Mary, then know that they don't know me by that name. They didn't see my birth certificate. They will be calling me by my middle name or by some shortened form of my middle name. So I'll get right into what I want to tell you about. In 1865, 24 former slave families settled in the Shenandoah Valley. And they settled in basically 5 different areas, those 24 families. They settled in to the southwest in a place called Blue Ridge, or sometimes called High Top Colony, the same place. Others settled in the Craigmont area. Some settled in North Fork, very few of them. Some on Flat Creek Road, also known as Lower Montreat, and Brookside. I think that's how it's known today. And the 5th place to the east would have been Ridgecrest. Now, the North Fork people and the Ridgecrest people of that time eventually came into Craigmont, the Craigmont area. So Craigmont stretched from north to the Mount Ellen down to old US 70. So that area is where things were happening. Actually, it's the biggest of those 5 areas. Now, Craigmont area is where Lige's family lived. It's where the old black walnut tree stood in his front yard, where my 1st grade teacher lived. It's where my schoolhouse was, Clearview. And it's where the 2 churches were, with Oak Grove Cemetery wrapped around Old Thomas Chapel, and this headstone's facing the east. Every headstone in that cemetery faces the east. Now, there's a question about whether that tradition came from the Muslim religion or the Christian religion. I suspect there's a heavy influence from the Muslim religion, but there's also some Christian influence. Okay, so I'd like to show you the picture of the Old Thomas Chapel Methodist Church. There it is. I don't have any pictures of the earlier chapels. They were most likely log cabins, but this is the first formal chapel that our people could afford to build. It was abandoned by the most recent congregation and was crumbling into dust. You would know that by looking at it now. It so happened that one day a builder from in town, I will not forget his name, Mr. Bill Gillum, happened to be driving through our community and saw this old church, what was left of a church, sitting at the edge of a cemetery. And he thought, so I heard, I want to rebuild an old church. Well, first he had to find out who owned that ghost of a building. It's ironic that with so many Methodists living in the community, he was directed to one of my Baptist cousins, and she and her daughter called me and my daughter. We got our heads together. But we had to get permission from the bishop to release ownership of that church before the builder could start to work, and we were able to do that. I was elected to write the letter, and that letter was passed by the congregation. They sent it on to the bishop, and he approved of our getting some work done on that church. Well, Mr. Gillum, who I call a good Samaritan, brought his crew and the materials that he was going to use. He built that chapel, rebuilt it from the foundation to the roof and the steeple that you see here. It is really a jewel that sits at the top of Craigmont Road. And we have now a restoration board there in Black Mountain that is maintaining that church. They are doing a wonderful job. Now, by the time I was born, and this is why my community is so special. By the time I was born, there were 2 surviving former slaves. Now, they had been born on the Step Plantation, and they were half brother and sister. But as it happened, okay, there were two former slaves in the community. They were dynamic workers. They had been born both on the Step Plantation, as I said, as half brother and sister, and like other mixed race children born on that plantation, we can talk about that later if you want to, they really didn't bond as siblings. They all knew one another because their mothers had told them who their father was. So I'd like to see the picture of the older one, John Myra Step, whom I refer to as Uncle John. He was 100 years old when this picture was taken, and he had a few more years to live. Uncle John was an active community leader. Without having gone to school a day in his life, he is said to have served on the Buncombe County Board of Education for nearly 30 years. And I'm sure he's the one who influenced the county to build a little school for Black children, because not all counties had one. He also started a little school of his own, a little nursery school, probably around the 1930s. Can we see a picture of this Flat Creek school? There it is. Now these kids, I'm not there that day, but these little children are my schoolmates and classmates. Some of them I can tell you, I know exactly who they are because their faces didn't change by the time they got to grade school. For some reason, the school was moved into a church up at the top of the hill. And I suspect it was moved up there because that church had indoor toilets. And this is not the stove either that was in that church. So I know this is a different place. So Uncle John did a lot of things for his community, a lot of things using his own money because he was very frugal. Although they said he was an awfully stern man. I don't think I've really ever met him in person, though I knew about him. And yeah, I've seen him. Okay, I want to talk a little about the younger former slave. My grandmother. Do you have that one? Number 4. There she is. This is my grandmother, Mary Elizabeth Louisa Stepp Burnette Hayden. This picture was taken about 1942. Here I am standing beside her, holding my little nephew and his sister, who was just about 2 years old or so, maybe a little older than that. But I'll tell you a little story about this little girl. In 1939, when Vera was born, the laws had come into being to stop midwives from delivering babies because they wanted the money to go to the medical doctors who were coming into practice. So they didn't realize that the people had no money to pay those medical doctors. But anyway, they prohibited, those laws prohibited Granny from delivering babies. But my sister said the women would send for Granny because they believed she knew more than the doctor did. And I was fortunate that she was present when Vera was born, because the doctor, for some reason, delivered this baby and rushed out of the house. And my sister said when she looked at the baby, she saw no facial features. So she was so frightened that she screamed for my grandmother. Granny was probably in the kitchen brewing teas. She came into the room, Granny came into the room, walked up to the bedside, ran her finger under Vera's chin and pulled that little thin skin of flesh away from her. She was just fine. Vera celebrated her 82nd birthday on May 6th. Now, my grandmother had learned her trade from her own mother, Hannah Stepp, who she said was the plantation herb doctor and midwife. And she said that Granny Hannah also performed some surgical procedures. Granny herself would not back away from an open wound. And my pre-teenage brother, Charles, told me that he had fallen on an old lard bucket and cut a gash in the fleshy part of his forearm. Well, they sent for Granny. Granny came, took her, after stuffing some coal soot into that wound, yes, she sewed it up. Well, Charles lived to be an old man. So Granny was delivering all of the babies, black and white. She didn't care whether they had money or not. She would go whenever somebody sent for her and catch that baby, as she said, as she loved to say. And Granny was very strong. She was very strong for her size. And she could cut wood at the age of 90. And she could also thread her needle without her glasses. You see, she's not wearing glasses. She's 84 in this picture. Granny lived to be 96 years old. She died in 1994. No, she died in 1954. I was told that Granny was the only African-American midwife of her time and in that place to be registered by the Buncombe County Board of Health. And I know that they sent her sterile supplies because she showed them to me. And I called them one day to try to get a record of her registration. And they told me, well, if we sent her supplies, she was registered with us. That was good enough for me. Now, I was still living in the San Fernando Valley in 2008 when I started writing my book. That was about 4 years after I had retired from teaching in the for the Los Angeles Unified School District, which is the second largest in the country. I woke up one morning realizing, gosh, nobody has written one line about these people, most of whom are already dead. All of their former slaves were dead. And I thought, I am the link between the last 2 generations of slaves and their children and anybody who comes after me. So I'd better start writing now. I was not the only one who was capable of doing this. Uncle John's youngest son was college educated, and he had a master's degree in sociology. He could have written a book. It would have been wonderful because he could have told some of his father's stories about slavery. My grandmother was only 5 years old when she left that plantation, and she had only one story to tell. And that story was that she remembered when the man rode up to her mother's cabin on a horse and read to them the Emancipation Proclamation, which Granny called that paper. Of course, it didn't mean anything because the slave master didn't recognize it unless there was a Union officer in the area to force him to do it. So they didn't get to leave until after the Civil War. Now, I would often wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning with a story on my mind, something that had happened that I wanted people to know about. And I would just jump out of bed and run downstairs to the computer and start writing. But I kept this up for 4 years. And then I realized that I was getting older in age. I'd better try to get back east to be closer to my children. Actually, that was a good thought. In 2014, I had moved back to, by 2014, I had moved back to Alabama, where I wanted to spend the rest of my life. But near the end of the year, I suffered a stroke. And that stroke damaged my right arm, injured my right arm and my left hand, which is kind of crippled. It handicaps me. But that's okay. I'm still going. Now, I could no longer live by myself after I had the stroke. I can't cook. I can't do some other things for myself. So I had to move to Michigan to live with one of my twin sons and his family, which is a very good move because then we got the book written. But by the time I settled here, I realized that my chapters were all over the place. Some were in storage, some were on flash drives, and some I couldn't find. I'm thinking, oh boy, I guess nobody's gonna get a chance to read this book after all the work I've done. But then one day, my daughter-in-law, who kept urging me to get the book written, I didn't know how that was gonna happen. She introduced me to a young English teacher who had computer skills that I certainly didn't have. And she came in and started working with me. And I would actually reproduce some of those chapters that were written. I would get them together from memory. Finally, we got that book together. And we got it submitted to Amazon.com. We got it published in the rough. I'm still editing. I'm not changing the chapters because there's nothing to change. Those chapters are real. but there are typos, and I admit to that, and I want to get those cleaned up. Now, my first story, and I have 22 altogether. My first story is about the Sunday that my family took me to the lake. I wanted to see Lake Tomahawk. We all wanted to see Lake Tomahawk, which was a WPA project that my father had worked on. Oh, we wanted to see this lake. There was no other lake close to where we lived. So we go to this lake. I've never seen so much water before. And I just want to get my hands in the water. But guess what? I can't do it. And I get so angry. This is my first encounter with Jim Crow. I can't stick my hand in that lake, although my father has helped to build it. So I'm so angry, I start crying. And my dad snaps a picture of my screwed up face. And I'm glad he did that, because when I look at that picture, I remember what happened that day. Could you show a picture of my father? This is Papa. He was 27 years old in this picture in 1909. Papa could always smooth things over when he saw that we were upset about racism or Jim Crow. And sometimes he would speak vaguely about things that I could not understand then. Sometimes he would, when he would talk about our Black people holding the short end of the stick in this country, I could understand that. But he would also talk about a war that we had lost. And I thought, what war? I didn't know anything about a war. Certainly World War II had not started then. I couldn't understand that. So I'm thinking later, maybe his grandparents told him a story about a tribal war in West Africa. And maybe one tribe, I guess, would have won that war, and the other tribe would have been sold to slave traders. Those things happen. I've heard college students from Africa speak about it and talk about how difficult it was in those days. So this is stuff that they didn't know about it, but it was they got it from their grandparents and great grandparents. And one of them told me that things were so bad that people were afraid to leave their homes and go to the farms, that you could be outside your house and you could be captured. But this caused a lot of hunger and suffering, as you can imagine. That had dire consequences. And Papa would also talk about some good laws on a book somewhere. I guess he was talking about the Constitution. And he would tell us that one day those laws would be found and upheld. So he always left us with hope. We still have that hope. And my mother developed my interest in family matters, but my dad was concerned about the future. Now, just as I returned to the lake, and you see Lake Tomahawk, 1996, just as I returned to this lake in 1996, determined to get my hands in that water, I've had to decide in my life, when I think of oppression and hardships, I've had to decide what was important and what was trivial. I walked around that lake to a place where I could get down to the water, and there were mosquito larvae breeding in the water. That was disgusting. If you have read the book, you may remember the chapter of The Darkest Night. My brother Wallace and I are on our way home from the Baptist church to our house at the foot of Mount Allen. We've been talking to entertain each other and to keep contact with each other, because that night, for some reason, there fell a pitch blackness over the community. We cannot see each other. So we're talking, and all of a sudden I realized that Wallace is not answering me, and I feel around in the darkness, there is no Wallace. People have asked me, what happened to Wallace? Well, I'll tell you, I'd like for you to think of this journey as a symbolic one, because I'm going through pitch darkness, but I know my way home. I know part of that darkness symbolically is that the lights, the street lights stop where my village begins, and so does the pavement. I know that I can't go to a library uptown and borrow a book, much less sit down in the library and read one. And I know that I'm not supposed to go beyond the 7th grade, but I come out of that darkness, and I would ask you to think of it that way, of coming out of darkness. I often wonder why I still can't remember walking into my house that night, because I got home safely, walking through the front or back door and seeing Papa, who would surely have been sitting by the fireplace anxiously waiting, smoking his pipe. And when I walked through that door, Papa would have said, if I could have remembered it, he could have said, "Where's Wallace?" I know he would have said that. Now, I've written 5 chapters about a family feud because I wanted people to know that the Hetfields and McCoys were not the only mountaineers who feuded. 3 sides of my family feuded among themselves. The Burnette feud started at the church. Can we see the Baptist church? This is about 1933. I'm not here. I'm probably at home with my oldest sister. But the principles of the feud are right here at church. That's where it started. And if I look over, well, she is in the back row. The back row, about 3 heads away from the corner of the vestibule. That's cousin Isabella. And then you go to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 5 from the left in the back row is Mr. Lang with his old battered up hat. He never changed that hat. So these people, the older ones, I can tell you, came into this world without so much recognition as a certificate of birth. And many of them are buried in Oak Grove Cemetery in unmarked graves because the families could not afford a grave marker. So there you see the principles of the feud. And I was so, actually, Mr. Lang, I think, he's not my most powerful character, but he is my favorite character. He would pass our house morning and evening during the summer, taking his cows to pasture. And I can still hear the clank of those bells coming by. If he's got a chance to talk to my mother from the road, he was going to do that. But in the book, I have captured a bit of his strange speech. One time he passes by, one evening he's on his way home, and he wants to tell my mother about his youngest son coming home on his first furlough from World War II. He's so proud of that. And he yells to my mother, "Miss Hetty, what do you reckon?" Well, that meant, guess what? His very, very strange speech, Mr. Langston McConaughey step. In the book, I've captured some of that speech and a bit about these old people. None of the ex-slaves are here. They are long gone. Now, all of these people also are long gone, but I have written about them in my book, and I want everybody to read about them. Can I see the picture of the book? Lies of the Black Walnut Tree tells you about the people of my community.
Well, thank you very much, Mary, for all the insights you shared so far. I'm sure we've got quite a few questions that have popped up during the presentation and chat. So, see, I'll let actually Catherine, if you want to pose some of these questions.
Yeah, we've got a few here. So Mary, if you feel comfortable answering, someone wonders, what year were you born?
1931, I'm 90 years old.
All right, that was an easy one.
Kind of proud to be here since so many people are gone.
Absolutely. So Patricia asks, so plantation owners could choose not to recognize the Emancipation Proclamation. When did they have
not unless they were forced to. Not unless they were forced to. If you have seen the movie Old Glory, did anybody see that? Glory, not Old Glory, but Glory. You see some slaves are trading along behind the army because they were freed then. No, if nobody came to enforce that law, it was my grandmother called it that paper. That paper. My grandfather told my mother he was 16 years old when the slaves were freed, when he called it the surrender. They knew. The surrender, that was April 9th, 1965. And I'm sure that's when they were all freed. Not one plantation freed 2 years, but no, didn't happen.
Yeah, and just quickly, that's where the holiday Juneteenth comes from, is enslaved people in Texas did not hear about emancipation until June.
Not until the crops were in. That was in June. Yes.
Yeah.
So if it wasn't enforced, it was not acknowledged.
Right. And then in Asheville, our Emancipation Day in Asheville is late April, like April 24th, 25th. So several weeks after the war was over.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Elizabeth wonders, has anyone sent a copy to Oprah?
I've tried to get in touch with Oprah, but I couldn't. I didn't get any response, or I'd get a bad email. I wanted to send her a copy. So if you know how I can get in touch with her, let me know, please.
Okay. Yeah.
Mary, Mary, somebody wanted to talk a little bit more about Miss Emmeline, the African woman that you describe in the book. Can you?
Oh, I'd love to talk about her. Yeah. Miss Emmeline, actually, her name, Miss Emma Darty, I knew her very well. She lived on Fortune Street with her granddaughter, her granddaughter's husband, and they had quite a big family. But Miss Emma was kind of a breadwinner in that family, and she took in laundry at home. Imagine doing laundry, having to wash those clothes by hand, probably with a rub board. I know they didn't have running water in the house. We didn't have running water in the house. She had to heat her irons on a cook stove. That meant that cook stove, the top had to be perfectly clean so she didn't get any soot on those white shirts where it's starched. But I would meet her on Monday mornings. That's when she would take the laundry back uptown. I thought it was the most remarkable thing to see this woman with a large basket of clothes on top of her head and a smaller basket under each arm. Now, there's no way she could have stopped that basket from falling. And she had to walk over a mile that way, uphill and downhill, into town and into somebody's house. And I'm sure that somebody had to lift that basket off her head because she couldn't have gone. She was already very tall. Miss Emma must have been at least 6 feet tall. She could not have gone into anybody's house with that basket on her head. And I've envisioned what has happened after she got into the house, how she might have walked over to a table and released one of those baskets. And then and only then did she have a free hand. She was the most remarkable woman in our whole village.
So Vivian asks, could you talk a little bit more about coming out of darkness? Did this have to do with your education? And she also wonders, where did you go to college and how was your experience?
Yes, that was a coming. You imagine being so oppressed you cannot put your hands in the water, in a lake, in a public park, in your hometown, a lake that your father has helped to build. I was crying because I was angry, not because my feelings were hurt. Yes, it was an awful darkness. Couldn't use the library in my town. We couldn't buy books, and we had no money to buy it with. And we can't use the books at the library. It didn't matter that our families had to pay taxes. We were oppressed. Yes, that is a darkness, a severe darkness, a crippling darkness. I mean, we've already been denied the right to read and write for 400 years, and now we're still being oppressed. And some of it is still going on today. Now, I've moved around a lot. I went to Burnette College my first year out of Allen High, and then I married and eventually ended up in California, where I went to a number of colleges. Actually, I've enrolled in a total of 8 colleges because I love to study. But I went to San Francisco State College that was on strike in 1968. And by the time I graduated with my master's degree, that was San Francisco, California State University at San Francisco. I went right through my last 3 years of college in 2 years and did my college master's degree coursework in 1 year. And fortunately, I did race through, although my advisor told me, "You're going too fast, Mary." But it was good that I did go fast, because when I finished my last course for the master's degree, there was a recruiter on campus from Washington, D.C., looking for somebody to go back east and teach at the nation's first land-grant college. So I stayed there for 8 years and wrote my master's thesis.
Well, and we don't have any more in the Q&A, but I have a question. I was wondering, one of the things that comes up a lot in our work is, and it's often surprising to people, how not far removed from the period of enslavement we are.
We're not far.
No, and so I wondered, was there any specific impact that growing up around folks who had been enslaved had on you?
Positively, yes. You can't imagine how intelligent these people were. I think that people may imagine a former slave as an old broken down person sitting in a corner somewhere. Uncle John and my grandmother were nothing like that. They were helping people. It seemed that that's what they lived for, to help people. It was wonderful. Yeah, absolutely wonderful.
Thank you. And then while I pull up these other questions, I also wonder, what was the impact of the change of the laws around midwifery on your grandmother and other communities?
Yeah, it stopped her from delivering babies. Now, golly, she wasn't making much money anyway, because some of those people couldn't pay her. And she used to tell me about coming home with a slab of meat. She got paid in kind because the people had no money. Coming home with a slab of meat, and she would hear a catamount, she called him. That was a cat of the mountain, a mountain lion stalking her, and how she would have to outsmart that animal in order to get home safely. You may hear about this again if you read it, this story. Oh golly, there was a movie, a film that was made in Asheville that talked about pulling off part of your clothing to distract the mountain lion, because he would stop and tear them to shreds, and that gave you a little more time to run.
Whew. Yeah, that sounds pretty intimidating.
Yeah, it is. But they did it, and they did it over and over. Yeah.
Trevor, I'll ask you, do you want us to do a couple more and then have a little bit of time to wrap up?
Yeah, sure. I think there are a couple more questions in the Q&A, and there's a question I want to ask you also, Mary, and we'll, it's all right if we roll just a little bit long here. But somebody wanted to know a little bit about your writing process with the English professor. How did that transform your memoir into a published book?
Oh, what she did, because my hand is crippled, what she did the typing for me. I didn't need her help as an English professor. She happened to be an English professor, and she was rushing to get ready to go back to school. I needed her skills and her hands, to get that book in submitted online, my manuscript submitted online. Yeah, I still keep in touch with her. Actually, she's written 2 books herself now and published them.
Yeah. Got a few more questions coming in, and some of these are really good. I remember reading, some of these in your book. One person asked if you can talk a little bit more about Black people being controlled by the clothes they wore, or their houses or cars. I know you talk about this a little bit in the book.
Being what?
How was the question phrased? Whether or not clothes and houses, cars, whether that was a status symbol that kind of marked people in the Black community in Black Mountain.
Not really. We were all poor, and that was the good part of it, because you didn't stand apart if you were poor, because everybody else was poor. I mean, I didn't think so much about being poor. Everybody was poor. The homes were not grand. The best house in the community was the home that my first grade teacher lived in. Her father was a storekeeper, and she was teaching. I guess she was making about $30 a month. That's more than the average person in the community was making, $30 a month. So they had a pretty nice house. My dad built our house. The nice thing was I never saw a rent collector when I was growing up. We lived on our own land. That was a saving, because a blessing, because my parents knew how to make that land feed us, and they also knew how to take care of animals. So we did not go hungry. In months when money was scarce, there was food in the vegetable cellar. We could go down to the cellar and we could pull that straw back and get some potatoes or some apples, and reach up on a shelf and get a can of soup or some string beans. And they even dried beans, because there was a time when we had no refrigerator. So in that sense, we were a little better off than many of our neighbors.
Yeah. Okay. We've got a number of questions about your experience at Allen High School. So could you briefly tell us, what was Allen High School and how was your time there? I know you personally knew Nina Simone, or she was Eunice Wayman, right, when you were at Allen High.
I did know Eunice. She was very nice. And I think that, well, first of all, I had changed schools every year since the 7th grade because of the difficulty in transportation And because we had to walk so far to the bus, especially in the wintertime, my mother had lost 2 teenage sisters to galloping consumption, they called it, because when the doctor found out that it was tuberculosis, that the patient had only about 6 weeks to live. So my mother had lost 2 teenage sisters and a nephew to galloping consumption. She was afraid that I would get sick from exposure to the weather. So because we had no reliable means of transportation, the family would ship me off to live with relatives. 400 miles away in Ohio for my 8th grade. And of course, the family's getting older, things are changing. So I came back home for the 9th grade, but I went to Stevens Lee. I told my mother, if I have to stay at this school, I will not be able to go to college because they are not offering a college prep course. Though they got shipped back to Ohio, and then my uncle became ill, and they had to move back to North Carolina, and I shipped off to California. I was there 1 year. Then I came back to Allen. Allen was my best school experience ever. It was small. All the teachers knew me, and I got a chance to participate in the Glee Club, and I would stay over at school when we had to go out, like on Sunday morning. I would stay at school, and usually I would stay in Nina Simone's room, and she would tell me how things were going for her. So a lot of girls were jealous of her because Nina was extremely talented, although she was well trained too, but she had a gift. And whenever we would go out to sing, the director would make sure that Nina got a chance to do a piano solo. And I remember we were at Old Country Church one day, an old country church, and Nina was playing, she loved Bach. She's playing something from Bach, and that piano is actually rocking. A piano it would rock on an uneven floor. And that one of the women, the hostess, came up and said to the director, well, that girl's going to turn that piano over on herself. I thought, couldn't you say something complimentary? But Nina was wonderful. And at Allen, I felt at home for the first time. It was actually the best school experience I've ever had.
Thank you. We have many questions. I want to ask one to kind of conclude and wrap up. One of the things I think is most powerful in your book, you have this quote from your father. He said, what this country stands for, like its greatness is more important than what this country allows today. And
he said that, yes.
As a child, I'm wondering as a child, what you thought was possible, what changes you thought you would see over your lifetime. And can you tell us a little bit about how those have been realized or not realized, or what have you seen?
A little has been realized. I thought certainly the time would come when we wouldn't have to ride in the back of the bus. We wouldn't have to ride in the back of the bus. And I'd like to tell you a little about that. My aunt, the one I lived with in Ohio, told me that there was a time when they were sitting anywhere they wanted on the buses in Asheville, from Biltmore to Asheville. But after the Atlanta Compromise, they called it. It wasn't a compromise because Booker T. Washington didn't say, okay, we'll go back into segregation. No, he was pleading for work for Black people because help was being brought in from Europe, and they were not hiring Black people who needed the domestic work and common labor. So he said, let down your buckets among us. We have served you all these years. Let down your buckets among us. We can be as separate as the fingers on one hand, but as united as a clenched fist. So that statement was misinterpreted, and the segregation laws became more enforced. Yes, and riding in the front cars of the train, they were the dirtiest cars. And if the train had wrecked, of course, there would be more injury to Black people who were forced to ride in the four frontmost cars. I also envisioned a time when we could go to a restaurant and sit down at a table and eat instead of having to go to the back door, if we would do it, and get a sandwich. Or a time when we could travel across country, and even going through the deep South, would be able to stay at a hotel instead of finding someone's house to stay at. We envision those freedoms, yes.
Well, Mary, thank you very much. Your insights are just absolutely phenomenal, and we thank you for being here tonight. And thank you everybody who sent in a question. I'm sorry we weren't able to get to those, but that's always a good thing. Also, Catherine, do you have anything?
Since COVID, and we're not really sure where things are headed right now, so we haven't planned any programs. But I do encourage in the near future, but I do encourage folks to please keep an eye on our websites. Go check those out. We're switching to a new database system at the end of this week, and our well-read blog, I know many of you are Heard Tell followers, is right now under construction. It's getting a renovation now that the room has been renovated. So I really encourage folks, if you haven't made it back out to the library since things started opening up, Special Collections is in the lower level of Pack Memorial Library, and we're open all the same hours as Pack. So I really look forward to seeing some of your faces here soon. It's been a delight to have folks sort of start to trickle back in. So we're excited to see you.
All right. Well, thank you. Mary, do you have any last final departing words for us?
I wanted to ask, are you sponsoring that session on Shiloh now and then? Or is that somebody else? Shiloh now and then? Or... Yeah, can you hear me?
So we have that. Yes. I'll share that right fast as well.
Yeah.
Okay. So yeah, we do have another event coming up, a later event in August on Shiloh, past and present. And it's we have two panelists on that. We actually have Anita White Carter, and then we have another young Asheville filmmaker. So we'll kind of have a panel to look at how this community has changed over time, and we definitely encourage you to come out for that. That'll be another Zoom virtual program.